The Imperial Guard are the indomitable spirit of humanity made manifest. For any foe that faces them will soon understand why they're called the Hammer of the Emperor. And there are no more truer paragons of this than the Death Korps of Krieg. For of all the many famous regiments that the Guard possess, the Death Korps hold a very special spot. For whilst Catechans, Cadians, and Vestroians may be flashy and of high merit, when you need the true steel of humanity, the Death Korps is who you call. And this has led many people to believe that the Death Korps is the best Imperial Guard regiment. And ladies and gentlemen, they're right. But you don't just have to take my word for it. Because ladies and gentlemen, here's 5 times that the Death Korps of Krieg proved they're the best Imperial Guard regiment. So starting off at number 5, we have a little bit of an all-rounder here. As this isn't one particular incident, but more so every single time that the Death Korps has faced up against the Tau. The Tau are known for being the new kids on the block. Essentially being very idealistic at the best times and utterly naive at the worst times. And this has led to many hilarious moments. Like that one time they agreed to a cultural exchange with the Dark Elder of all people. But some of my favorite moments of this all come when they first interact with the Imperium. And we get a rare case of aliens being shocked by human behavior. Not just shocked, but truly and utterly appalled. Indeed, the fanaticism displayed by the Imperium made the Tau people question a whole lot of stuff. But no more was this made ever true than when they first encountered the Death Korps of Krieg. For whilst a normal person of the Imperium can be said to be called a fanatic, the Death Korps are something altogether bloody different. To say that the Tau underestimated humanity would be one hell of an understatement. But to say that the Tau underestimated the Death Korps of Krieg, well, that's actually not true. It's not that the Tau underestimated them, it's that the Tau just couldn't even comprehend that a force like the Death Korps of Krieg could even exist. Indeed, for there are plenty things that the Tau consider to be completely, totally and utterly anathema to them, that the Death Korps make their Sunday special and regular routine. A prime example of this comes from Tau vehicle design. When encountering the Tau, that vehicle's designed to be swift, agile and efficient, yes, but most importantly, they're designed to protect their pilots. To the Tau, preserving and protecting people is the most important aspect. Very admirable. However, when you compare that to the Death Korps of Krieg's way of waging war, you can see that they're quite different. For the Death Korps will throw any bodies, regardless of who, what, when, where, why, so long as it will achieve victory. And this often led to the Tau suffering grievous losses at their hands. The thing is though, the Death Korps are a siege regiment. They're built for attrition. The Tau, being one of the most smallest factions in all of the setting, most definitely are not. Which often lead to shocking, if brutal and bloody victories for the Imperium. Or the Tau achieving a victory that ended up becoming a brutal Pyrrhic slog, rather than a quick killing Moncard that it was supposed to be. And this right here shows an excellent example of the Death Korps. The Death Korps are determined beyond any and utter thing. The Death Korps are unique in the Imperium not because they're willing to charge into basically death. Hell, we have penal battalions and fanatic battalions that do that all the time. The thing is though, those are regiments made to be thrown away. Penal battalions are literally criminals. Fanatic zealots are fanatics of the church. Both of those have low regard of societal status and are very poorly armed. The Death Korps, however, the Death Korps are one of the most advanced as well as well-equipped guard regiments that there is, with the Imperium giving them literally specific technology to help increase their numbers, that being the Vita Womb, or artificial cloning. Dark Age technology stuff. The Death Korps are no sloppy fanatics, nor are they crazed criminals. They are a very, very elite, disciplined, well-maintained, utterly loyal force. In very many cases, they are the elite of the elite. And that's talking about the standard trooper. Yet these utmost elite troopers are still treated like nothing when it comes to the meat grinder. That is what makes the Death Korps so unique and special. The fact that they're willing to put so much time and effort into these trainings. Even their elite Grenadier Corps suffer a near 80% casualty rate. And again, a big misconception people get about the Death Korps is that they're just charging suicidally. I always explain to people like this. If you tell a Krieger to go and charge a machine gun nest, he won't, because it serves no purpose. However, if you tell a Krieger to charge that machine gun nest while it's being outflanked by grenades, they'll gladly do that. They will gladly sell their lives, but they will not waste them. Because to the Emperor, their service must be paid in blood, and it must be a meaningful sacrifice. So you combine the ability to sacrifice yourself wholeheartedly in combination with some of the best tech ever against an enemy and foe who doesn't fundamentally understand or comprehend how you fight. Well, you get stories like these, taken from Less Than Human. Hundreds of Krieg barrels popped up and cracked as targets entered their range. Amid the bright pulse beams, their output looked anemic, their rate of fire slower, but their wielders, dug in behind their walls, had time on their side. Their overclocked lasguns chipped away at the Tau shells, wearing them down, until the first one and then another toppled. Some made it through the light storm. Even so, they tore through barbed wire coils, kicked sandbags aside with contemptuous ease. Suddenly there were 6, maybe 7 Tau amongst the Krieg in forward trenches. Their battlesuits, fashioned from some arcane Xenos alloy, were lightweight but robust, giving them a huge advantage in close combat. The Krieg in turn had far superior numbers. Even in such cramped confines, their ears ringing, unable to coordinate their actions, they swarmed the invaders and pinned their limbs to keep them from aiming their weapons. Junior officers pumped bolter rounds into Tau armor, creating fractures. Knives and bayonets levered those fault lines open. The stealth-suited Tau were not a lone force, but scouts for a hunter cadre. As they occupied their enemies, the rest of their company charged to the forest in their wake. A broad-nosed gunship forced its way through knots of brittle trees, balancing on anti-gravity engines. Laser beams swept the burnt ground in its path, seeking prey for its missiles and ion cannons. It was crewed by an eager team of fire warriors, while 10 more teams kept pace with it on foot. In the trenches, the scouts were proving more resilient than skilled. Too proud of their blasphemous technology, their enemies considered, and far too reliant upon it. Their arm-mounted guns sprayed plasma fire about themselves. They fought to reach the Earthshakers and disable them, either by reducing them to slag or by killing their crews. They didn't care which. Urgent directives buzzed in Krieg earpieces. They had to deal with these invaders quickly before the larger threat overran them. As always, they rose to the challenge. One by one, the Tau scouts were peeled from their armor, exposing leathery grey-blue hides and flat, noseless faces. One pleaded for mercy, in vain, in some alien tongue, while another self-destructed as its life ebbed from its body. It took 3 corpsmen with it, wounding several more. The last scout triggered its jetpack, attempting to escape, unable to shake the deathly grips of a dozen gloved hands. It was dragged back down to a grisly fate. The Krieg crewed their cannons and shouldered their lasguns again. The charging fire warriors had crossed just half the distance to them, and now were facing a deadlier gauntlet than they had been prepared for. A well-placed shell vaporized a 5-strong squad of them, and by the time the smoke of the explosion had cleared, their comrades were in full retreat. The skirmish was over as quickly as it had begun. Krieg quartermasters dealt with the wounded and the dead, while sentries resumed their watches. Engineers worked on the damaged guns continued to dig sap tunnels from trenches towards the Tau encampment. They waited for the next wave of attackers to come marching into their clutches. And that perfectly encapsulates the Krieg. It does not matter who, it does not matter what. If you fight the Death Corps, they will find a way to kill you. For those wondering, these were not battlesuits but rather stealth suits. Essentially, Tau versions of powered armor. Not really, but hey, close enough. And just that mental image of a soldier in powered armor, trying to escape, trying to activate jump jets, but literally being held down by a dozen men, before slowly having his armor cracked open with knives, and then brutally stabbed to death as he begged for mercy. That is metal as hell. That is scary as hell. And that is the reality of the Death Corps. It does not matter how many of them they lose, they will get the job done. And I can very much so understand why the Tau would be frightened of them. For in this case, the Tau pleading for mercy were far more human than the Death Corps of Krieg. Later on in that story, Amoid Gazan would be shocked by how the Krieg acted. The Krieg would feign a retreat before surging back and counterattacking, charging battlesuits, actual battlesuits, in a bayonet charge, mosh-pitting them just long enough for their heavy weapons to get a beat on them and destroy them completely. Because as I said, the Death Corps will sacrifice anything and anyone to get the job done. Also, on a side note, this really goes to show the difference between powered armor and Space Marines. Because a Space Marine is not a Space Marine because it's powered armor. Like a Space Marine would never panic if his armor was slowly being peeled away. Tau though, the Tau did. Mindfully so, mind you, but still. It's another nice example of the difference between Space Marines, and how just because you have powered armor doesn't make you invincible. Rather, what makes you invincible is a sheer lack of humanity, something the Astartes and the Death Corps have much in common. But now, onto the next one. At number 4, we have the Orpheus War. The Orpheus War takes place in the Orpheus subsector, and it was between the Imperium and the Maranach dynasty. For those of you who don't know, Maranach is a special type of Necrons that are all about murder. Particularly, they are led by a matriarch known as the Queen of Oblivion. These are the Orange Boys. They want to kill literally everything. Very close to the Destroyer cult in that sense. I don't know if they're exactly related one-to-one, but I wouldn't be surprised. And it would be in the late 90s of M41 that the Maranach dynasty would awake completely, and the Orpheus subsector would get its first learning of these foul Xenos, with but a simple message being repeated on every single astral navigation and astropath chart. Maranach comes. Maranach comes. Maranach comes. That was the only thing they heard of and knew of. Thus, the governor at the time decided he needed to rally a lot of forces, and began asking for everyone, including Imperial Guard and Astartes, including 2 full line corps of the Death Corps, that being the 60th Line Corps and the veteran 17th Line Corps, led by Marshal Karanus Werner. For those of you wondering, Krieg regiments are combined into multiple different types of corps. The Siege Regiment is a standard line regiment, which is a combined armed formation. There are also artillery regiments and armored regiments. A line corps basically means that it's made up mostly of siege regiments, aka primarily infantry. Armored corps, it's mostly armored, and artillery corps, mostly artillery. Line corps are the most common, for obvious reasons, with the 17th and the 60th being both of them. But it turns out this buildup of forces was exactly what Maranach wanted. For it would be later revealed in a letter of an Inquisitor regarding this that it is believed that the Necrons of Maranach wanted there to be more fighters here. They gave enough time and chance for there to be forces, because supposedly they wanted to die like warriors. It's very Necron-y, but also very interesting. But regardless of who, what, when, where, why, the fact of the matter is the Necrons came to the world of Amaranth and the Orpheus subsector, and they came prepared. The Void battle was short but incredibly bloody. The Doomsires and Nightsides soon overwhelmed the Imperial forces, and the sky was lost. The Aeronautica Imperialis and the Imperial Navy were forced to fall back, leaving the ground forces at the mercy of the Necron raids. Yet, as the Necrons landed their forces on the ground, they realized that this fight would not be so one-sided as was the air war, for it was spearheaded by millions of Death Corps of Krieg personnel, led again by High Marshal Venier. The High Marshal would arrange his forces in a complete defensive formation, and here the absolute masterclass of siege defense came into play, for little by little, bit by bit, he led them into trap after killfield, slowly whittling down their numbers. So much so that even caused them to retreat in some cases. With the Death Corps buying ground, they would feign retreats, charge into prepared positions, lead them into assaults via artillery as well as heavy weapons. Their elite grenadier units would form shock brigades that would break the enemy when least expected, allowing for the rest of the formations to overwhelm them with numbers. Maranach was having a hard time of it, but despite all the success, Venier knew the truth. This was all temporary. Eventually, he and his forces would be slowly ground down. He had to make a choice. He had to do something decisive. And instead of letting his brave veteran soldiers die slow, painful, and diseased deaths, he decided to find where the enemy was and to hit them, and hit them hard. So eventually he would locate a command monolith, the hub of all enemy activity on the planet, and he would resolve that he would destroy this, one way or another. Taken from Imperial Armor, Volume 3. Marshal Werner arranged his forces for attack, even as intelligence came in from forward observers of alien stars being seen in the rent-open storm above the pyramid, through which blasted flares of emerald energy that surged up from its apex with deafening reports. As they moved into position, each of the men of the Death Corps assault brigades knelt in silent, ordered ranks, crouching in the rubble and ash, waiting for the call to battle as the alien lightning flashed and flickered in the shrouded night. Between the ruins in which the Death Corps marshaled and the Necron defenses lay was a rough kilometer of open ground, blasted flat and scorched, making the killing zone which they would have to cross to reach their objective. The signal was given at last, and the Death Corps rose as one and began to advance across slowly, evenly gathering pace as they left the rubble and entered the blasted ground. Immediately, the curving arcs of sentry pylons materialized on the walls of the citadels and turned to track the advancing army. Arcs of power visibly flared along the strange Necron battlements. Then, the the killing began. Howling beams of emerald energy blasted great swaths of men from existence, while Tesla cannons spat volleys of lightning that left anything they touched as blazing cinders. Hundreds fell in the first moments, but the Death Corps' line did not waver in its advance. And now, deep in the ruins behind them, their own guns spoke. Impassively, forward artillery observers had noted the range and disposition of the Necron's own heavy weapons and marked them for destruction. Veneer had ordered that no munitions were to be spared, no cannon left in reserve, and the Death Corps Basilisks and Praetors answered his call with a furious bombardment, sending tons of shells into the air to fall like deadly rain on their targets. Instantly, the pyramid and its sub-citadels were wreathed in a mantle of flame as hundreds of shells burst against the alien structure. The pyramid flickered for a moment, like a mirage on the horizon, before becoming solid once again. One of its outlying obelisk towers blasted to fragments in a stream of arcane lightning. Soon, as the bombardment lashed out again, great chunks of black masonry were torn free from the structure, and an eerie howl cut across the battlefield, clearly audible, even over the thunder of shellfire. The Necron firepower was quickly redirected upwards, sweeping the skies and blasting apart the shells before they could reach their target. And in their spite, the Death Corps pressed their advantage, surging forwards, while Verna's tank companies made themselves known. On the left flank, a squadron of Macarius Omega plasma tanks unleashed blasts like miniature suns towards the defense pylons, heedless of their overheating cannon, in their determination to strip the citadel of its defenses, while on the right, Centaur carriers sped forth through a storm of Gauss fire, which blasted scores of them to shrapnel in order to deploy their quad launchers as close as possible to the enemy. Thousands fell, tanks erupted into fire, and a blizzard of enemy shells was hurled against the Black Pyramid, which began to break and crack, smoke billowing, and a tintic lightning playing sickly across its splintering surface. Behind the Imperial lines, the companies of troops left behind to defend the artillery position found themselves beset, and in a desperate battle to save off twisted, blade-handed flayers that came for them from the shadows. Just as Necron attack craft streaked from the skies to strafe them into oblivion, the squadrons of Imperial Lightnings and Avengers that tore through the night to intercept the lethal night scythes of the Necrons were few, but bravely they dove straight into the heart of the enemy squadrons, their weapons blazing in the darkness, each pilot commending their soul to the Emperor, and knowing that this would be their final battle. The die was cast. The battle was held in balance, and there could be no holding back. Already tens of thousands lay dead on the blasted plain before him, but Werner did not falter in ordering forth the second wave, raising his sword high and leading the charge himself across the deadly ground. The Death Corps filled the battlefield like a living tide of steel and fire, and crushed and toppled the remaining canoptic stalkers that barred their path, trampling the scattering scarabs into the earth. The Death Corps reached the outer citadels of the pyramid complex, just as their own shellfire began to falter at last. But for the Necrons, it was too late. The enemy was already upon them, the human soldiers swarming like ants across the alien fortifications. Surrounded, the Necron warriors were brought down in a murderous crossfires, and the machine creatures were driven back and destroyed one by one, as for every Krieg the Necrons slaughtered, a dozen more took their place. Everywhere across the structure, breacher charges were slammed into place, and multi-bombs were hurled into energy conduits and cracks in the armored edifice. The violent detonation of the Black Pyramid blinded onlookers 5 kilometers distance and carved an ash-white crater out of the wasteland that was clearly visible to vessels in orbit above the battle-savaged world. Although elsewhere the Imperial defenders also saw degrees of success, holding off and not repelling the invaders, the Necron invasion had been murderously effective. Each of the 3 major hive cities was in ruin. The planet's principal starport had been overrun, and its keystone defense facilities had been reduced to rubble. The death toll had climbed into billions, and Amara Prime burned. On Amara Prime, the Death Corps did not win the battle, but they certainly held it off. The Orpheus War would be a brutal blow to the Imperium, but it could have been made much worse, and certainly much quicker, if the Death Corps had not been there. The Death Corps were able to fight, destroy, and swarm Necrons, living undead from ancient days of eldritch times, because the Death Corps possessed a determination second to none. Even in a position such as this, where they could have held out for much longer, with lines upon lines of defensive artillery taking their toll, Werner could have had his boys drag this out for months. But ultimately, that is not what would help achieve victory. It would do nothing but slowly deplete his men. They would gain a few more months of life, yes, but what victory was there for the Imperium? So, true to his nature and that of the Death Corps, he chose the option that would most please the God Emperor. And he sought the lives of him and his Kriegers to wound the enemy viciously. And viciously were they wounded, at the cost of many Krieg lives. And eventually the Orpheus War would claim both corps, but the Necrons will not forget the Sons of Krieg. But now on to number 3. Next up we have the battle for the world of Tarsus Ultra. Tarsus Ultra was quite an important system in Ultramar, with it bearing the title of Ultra, but when during the Great Crusade, Guilliman had been on the world, and he had led the charge personally to bring it to compliance. During that, however, he would be ambushed, and, according to legend, have his life saved by a guardsman raised from the world in service of the Imperium. So honored was he of his heroism, and the heroism of the planet, that he would give it the title of Ultra. Essentially, it was rather important. However, in late 90 M41, this world would become the target of none other than High Fleet Leviathan. Thus, sent to defend against his planet were none other than the captain of the 4th Company, Euro Ventress, and his Ultramarines. They also received assistance from the Mortifactors chapter, led by Chaplain Astador, including 2 Imperial Guard regiments, the 10th Logis Regiment, led by Colonel Octavius Raublek, and the 933rd Death Corps of Krieg Regiment, led by Colonel Truman Strigler. The defense of the PDF and Guard, supported by the Space Marines, was admirable to say the least, and the hordes of Tyranids found themselves lying dead upon the world. But it was all in vain, for the Tyranids were numerous. However, it is then that Inquisitor Kryptman, who had been working together with agents of the Death Watch and the Ordo Xenos, would reveal that he had managed to devise a poison made from a captured lictor. This poison, if administered to the Noon Queen, would kill her, thus severing the connection of the hive mind to the invading tendril, meaning that they would be naught but mindless animals, easy for the slaughter. However, for the Ultramarines to do so, the main forces would need to be preoccupied, and to that role fell to the Imperial Guard. Thus, the Death Corps of Krieg, in their staunch lines of trenches, would stand fast against the unrolling tide. However, during this time, the hive mind would unleash more Tyranids, far more than ever be imagined. The current position would be overrun. Thus, Colonel Rebek would order that the entirety be pulled back to a new defensive line to buy more time, thinking of his fellow men and not wanting them to die meaningless deaths. But little did Rebek know that to the Death Corps, there is no such thing as a meaningless death if you die killing the foes of the Emperor. Taken from Warriors of Ultramar. "What the hell are you talking about?" snapped Lieutenant Konarski, grabbing the headphones from the Vox operator and jamming them to his ear. His eyes widened as he heard the panicked voice of Colonel Rablek, screaming for them to evacuate the trenches. He tossed back the handset and ran to the trench periscope, pressing his face to the viewing plate. Biting back a curse, he swung the scope from left to right and felt a cold band of iron close around his chest as he saw a tide of alien monsters hurtling towards their position. "Shit," said Konarski, and unslung his lasgun from his shoulder. He ran along the trench, shouting at his men to stand to. "Sir?" called his Vox operator. "We're not evacuating?" Casting his gaze along the line of trench and seeing the other Krieg officers pushing their men into the trench's firing step, he said, "No, son, we're not." "But Colonel Rablek's orders—"
"Damn Rablek! We're the Death Corps of Krieg, son. Do you think that was just a pretty name? We never retreat. We fight and we die. That's the Krieg way."
As terrifying as the first attacks on the trenches had been, they were but a shadow of this assault. A massive multi-limbed beast stampeded forwards, smashing giant craters into the ice as it charged. Steaming jets of scalding acid sprayed from its grotesque organic tubes sunk beneath its massive jaws, dissolving snow, ice, and flesh in smoking conflagrations. Hundreds of spines fired with monstrous muscular contractions hammered the trenches, punching through meters of snow to skew above men and tanks. A boiling tide of creatures swarmed around the legs of the gargantuan beast, chitin-clad organisms with bony prows and curled forelimbs, hurled fleshy paws which burst in lethal sprays of razor-sharp bone and bioacids. Slow-moving, each creature excreted another organic missile as it slithered across the ice. Similarly bulky creatures with fused bony forelimbs that resembled long organic cannons spat crackling chitin shells that hammered the retreating tanks with sprays of corrosive viruses and acids. Crackling electric energy leapt from the giant claws of thick serpentine creatures that hurtled across the ice, their rasping armored hides throwing up clouds of ice crystals in their wake. But leading the charge even faster than the multitude of ravening organisms that made up the bulk of the Tyranid swarm was a clutch of enormous creatures that smashed their way forwards on gigantic claws that dragged their bloated bodies across the ice with terrifying rapidity. Brood nests pulsed with a grotesque patistic motion between the bony plates of their hides, and ripping muscle contractions hurled razor-edged spines towards the trenches. A dark cloud of gargoyles massed above the attacking aliens, a massing black brood mother moving amongst them, its monstrous wings flapping ponderously as it descended towards the men of Krieg. Lieutenant Kanaski retched as he pushed the dissolving remains of his Vox operator from his legs to fall into a pool of smoking acids that melted its way through the trench's duckboards. He tried to stand, but the acrid stink of seared flesh doubled him up with a fierce coughing fit. Blood and smoke filled the trench as Tyranid missiles burst around their shattered defenses. Here and there shots were returned, but it was a drop in the ocean compared to the fire they were receiving. Finally overcoming his nausea, he shouted, "For Krieg!" and fired over the lip of the trench. A dark shadow blotted out the light from the sun, and Kanaski looked up in time to see a gigantic monstrosity with wings 10 meters wide swooping low towards the trenches. Scores of smaller beasts clung to its belly, and a swirling fire built in between its jaws. He risked a glance over his shoulder to see why no one was shooting the damn thing down. As he saw the nearest Hydra, he realized why. Its frontal section was a molten, twisted mass, thick armored plating liquefied by corrosive viruses and acids. Gory slime oozed from the vehicle's interior, the disintegrating flesh of its crew steaming in the cold air. But Kanaski saw the Hydra's gun section was still intact. He dropped his rifle and sprinted towards the quad-barreled gun. He had to get it firing again. Huge shrieking creatures with scything arms and horrific organic weapons poured over the trenches, tearing his men apart. Swarms of smaller creatures leapt and killed around them. Desperate hand-to-hand combat raged as his troopers violently attempted to stem the alien tide. Giant fleshy monstrosities disgorged hordes of clawed monsters that he recognized as gene stealers. Everywhere they were being overrun. Kanaski crouched low and held his gloved hand across his nose and mouth as the stench of melted human flesh assailed him. He scrambled across the stinking remains of the crew, sliding up into the gunner's compartment. "Yes!" he shouted as he saw that the guns were still powered and fully loaded. Gripping the firing handles, he slewed the 4-barrel turret around to face the giant flapping monster. Kanaski punched the firing studs, and a 4-meter tongue of flame roared from the muzzles to strafe the sky with fiery explosions. The gun rocked with powerful recoil, pumping out hundreds of shells every few seconds. Kanaski screamed as he fired, the horror of the last few days washing from his body in a storm of adrenaline. Through the vision blocks, he saw the flying beast torn apart as the close-range blast ripped through its bony armor plates to detonate within several of its vital organs. Screeching, it tumbled from the sky, rolling in a flurry of snow and alien blood to crush the brood it carried with its bulk. Explosions of colored fumes erupted from its belly, noxious clouds of alien toxins blanketing the ground, and green tendrils spilling into the trenches. Working the gun left and right, he shredded every alien he could see, keeping the firing studs depressed long after the ammunition had run out. Seeing the sacrifice of the men of Krieg, Colonel Rablek would order his Capital Imperialis, a monstrosity of a super-heavy vehicle, to advance forward and support them. Together, the combination of Krieg, as well as the Longrens, would gather the bulk of the Tyranid force into the position, before Rablek would contact the Krieg colonel and tell him that he knew what to do, accepting his death, as the remaining artillery pieces of the Guard shelled their position, taking out each and every one of them, including the large chunk of Tyranid forces. Soon, the Norn Queen would be assassinated, and the hive mind would be left without one of its tendrils, and the world of Tarsus Ultra would be saved, at least in name. For whilst the Tyranids were dead, their bioforming of the planet had left it uninhabitable, and whilst there would be a small garrison on world, eventually, through the machinations of the warsmith known as Honsu, he would manipulate an Adeptus Mechanicus device, a serum made to help with crop growth, and manipulate it, twist it and change it into a virus that would leave Tarsus Ultra into a dead world, forever earning the ire of the Mechanicum, who swore vengeance on such a degradation of act. On Tarsus Ultra, the Death Corps of Krieg showed their steel. They stood, they fought, and they died. Now, whilst granted this is a bit of an early introduction of Krieg, so it's not completely 100% set in stone, it does go a good way to show exactly what they were meant to be, men who stood and died, but only when a purpose required them. It also showed that the rest of the Guard were not so easily outdone by the men of Krieg, and that the steel that the Krieg had were not exclusive to them, but they were definitely the best cases of show when it came to it. For the Death Corps of Krieg is in fact just not a pretty name. But now, on to number 2. And at number 2, ladies and gentlemen, we have the very origins of the Death Corps themselves. You see, Krieg used to be a paradise world in fact. And yes, I'm not going to gloss over the fact that they named a paradise world Krieg. Foreshadowing and all that, I suppose. Essentially, Krieg was ruled by a ruling oligarchy. And this oligarchy decided that, you know what, paying taxes is kinda dumb. So they decided they would rebel against the Imperium. And it's made very clear that this rebellion was completely, totally and utterly unnecessary. The fact of the matter is they just didn't want to pay. It wasn't the case that they were being forced to pay too much or forced to give anything. These guys were just bastards, plain and simple. And pretty much every single one of the planet, and pretty much most of the planet would side with them. Except, however, for one, the Hive of Ferrograd, led by Colonel Jurten, the last remaining loyalist colonel of Krieg, and what many believe to be the founder of the Death Corps. Also, if you want a bit more in-depth, there's a whole book about it known by Krieg by Steve Lyons. Steve Lyons has a lot of Krieg stuff, so if you like him, go check it out. But Jurten was in a tough spot. His hive was already besieged. He only had one regiment and a few guard PDFs that were there. He didn't have nearly enough forces to win the planet, let alone survive the siege. Thus, he would be presented with a choice, as one of the loyalist Magos would lead him underground, and his choice and the decision he made would change the fate of the Imperium forever. Taken from Imperial Armor, Volume 5. But the situation for the Loyalists was dire. The rebel forces outnumbered in millions, and Ferrograd was soon cut off and besieged. To make matters worse, the Loyalists were on their own. The planetary defenses were under control of the traitors, and strong enough that a full-scale fleet action would be required to breach them. Jurten had been informed that in no uncertain terms, that a fleet powerful enough to invade Krieg was simply not available. Colonel Jurten's orders were to resist with all means at his disposal, to engage the enemy, to punish their treachery, and emerge victorious, whatever the cost. So faced with the horrific odds stacked against him, Jurten came to the fateful decision that the world of Krieg would belong to the Emperor, or it would belong to no one. Deep below High Ferrograd was a secret Adeptus Mechanicus storage, and Colonel Jurten, with his loyal Adeptus Mechanicus ally, Archmago's Greel, moved to unlock the facility and unleash the forbidden and ancient weapons within. Whilst the outside siege ground on, within Ferrograd's walls, the defenders labored on a desperate plan. On the feast of the Emperor's ascension, Jurten unleashed his long-planned counterattack. Scores of long-range missiles roared forth from the heart of Ferrograd. The traitors helplessly watched their augurs as Jurgen's rockets arched high into the planet's stratosphere before detonating in blooms of blinding light and unleashing tons of lethal isotopes which blanketed the entire world in deadly fallout. For days, the atmosphere became a sea of nuclear fire. Under Jurgen's attack, the planet's ecosystem failed, the air was poisoned, and Krieg's climate collapsed into storms that spanned continents. The raging fires blocked out the sun, and a nuclear winter engulfed Krieg. As a result, until billions died. Those who did not perish took to their new fallout shelters and began a new subterranean existence. To future generations who would live within the terrible consequences of the atomic attack, Jurten's plan would become known as the Purging. Krieg might have been wrecked, but the Purging had evened up the odds. The Loyalists had been well prepared for the attack, and the traitors suffered terribly, but the Civil War would go on. Indeed, regardless of whether you were Loyalist or traitor, it seems that the men of Krieg were built of one hell of a hard stuff. For even after all this, the Civil War would rage on for another 500 more years, before eventually the Loyalists would reclaim the planet. From there, they would contact the Adeptus Administrorum and request permission to serve in the Imperial Guard once more. Krieg had nothing else to offer. There were no artisans, as everyone was made to making war. There were no goods and materiel because, well, it was a hellscape. But the one thing it did have was soldiers. Thus, the Ministorum allowed for them to have one single regiment deployed. The Krieg, however, requested that they have 20 ready and available and be deployed immediately to the most deadliest war zones. Now, this event is important to the Krieg, but it's very much so needed that we realize how it is important. This set up the whole idea of the Cult of Sacrifice. The Cult of Sacrifice is a subdivision of the Imperial faith. And contrary to what many people believe, it's not about the Kriegs killing themselves. Rather, it's the case that since the original Krieg rulers sinned against the Emperor, they carry that guilt for all eternity. And the only way to rid themselves of that guilt is to personally die in the service of the Emperor, be it by manufacturing shells or by dying on the front lines. But that death has to be in service of the Emperor and worthwhile. Nothing more, nothing less. And it's really interesting when you think about it, because this is essentially the wrong way to think. Because the people who betrayed Krieg, their descendants are all dead. The only descendants of Krieg that are left are the loyalists who never betrayed the Emperor and were willing to kill their world to save it. It's a very interesting dichotomy here, because they're carrying guilt that's not theirs, but it's this guilt that has pushed them and pushed them and pushed them to achieve extraordinary measures. Because they're not just achieving it for themselves, but for everyone who's ever existed since the loyalists reclaimed the world. It's this cultural idea that they owe something to the Emperor, but not just something. They owe everything. That's why I'm always very interested to see if either the Guilliman or the Lion interacting with Krieg. Because would it be a case of Krieg would actually be redeemed in the eyes of Big G, and then from there they would be able to serve more effectively? Or would they just do the 40k thing and brush it off? Kind of like how Helbrecht did when he interacted with the Guilliman. It's an interesting question. But this goes to show that the people of Krieg, particularly in High Ferrograd, were so loyal to the Emperor, felt so strongly about him, that their influence is still felt 10,000 years later. Regardless of what you may think about the Death Corps, they are stubborn, and they are tenacious. Not only in their defense, but in every aspect of their life. The fact of the matter that they are able to hold on to something so strong in a cultural identity for thousands of years is very impressive. Or crazy, but hell, this is the Death Corps, so it's both. But ladies and gentlemen, on to the final. And at number 1, y'all were expecting this, the Death Corps of Krieg's biggest claim to fame, the Siege of Vraks. If you haven't heard about the Siege of Vraks, I'm going to assume that you joined 40k today. The Siege of Vraks is one of the most infamous and beloved settings of all of 40k. TLDR, Vraks was an armory world. It was also a shrine world, and it was led by a chap by the name of Cardinal Zafin. Through a series of absolute crazy bullshit that totally could have been avoided, Zafin would end up going renegade. Essentially, he began recruiting for terrorist militia, men-at-arms, which were outlawed because of Goj Van Dyer and his nonsense way back when. He called on a crusade to liberate the Imperium from the unjust who occupy it, and eventually that soon turned up into him rebelling. Of course, it's now believed that he was manipulated by Chaos into doing so, but there's so much of that going around it's hard to know. Regardless, the Administrator of the Imperium tried to get rid of him. He even managed to survive a Vindicated Assassin, which is kind of bullshit, not gonna lie, but hey, story needs to happen. Eventually, however, it would be decided that Vraks had to be reclaimed the old-fashioned way, with boot and blade, and for a siege, they sent the very best, the Death Corps of Krieg, and the Krieg 88th Siege Army. What was initially supposed to be a short 12-year siege ended up becoming a 20 grueling year slogfest, filled with demons, traitors, Chaos Space Marines, as well as 3 different Imperial Armor Commanders. One completely inaptitude, lazy fat son of a bitch, the Giga Chad Marshal Gregori himself, who should have really been in touch, and Inquisitorus Rex, who was kinda okay, 5 out of 10, it was okay. This story was covered in a number of Imperial Armory books, and has been mentioned time and time again, and so many people have covered it, I could give you the whole goddamn rundown. But instead of me doing that right here and now, I may say that for another series, let me know if you guys want that. I want to just cherry pick my favorite moment from all of the scenarios, and just share that with you. It comes to us for the first time the Death Corps Krieg see the Citadel, essentially the final strong point for the Renegades of Vraks. From there, the assault brigades of the Death Corps surge forward. Grenadiers, the elite shock troops of the Death Corps, leading the charge. However, it was there for the first time demons would appear, and what seemed to be the cusp of final victory turned into a devastating defeat. For the Death Corps were pushed back and would have been overwhelmed, if not for the brave actions of some grenadiers. For in the breaches of the Citadel itself The grenadiers formed ranks, kneeling and standing, and unloaded their hot-shot lasguns, spewing forth hordes of laser into the oncoming rushing demons. Rank after rank of grenadier opened fire and took a heavy toll on the demon presence. However, eventually their ammunition would run dry, and they would be forced to charge the demons. Those grenadiers died that day, but they died fighting for the Emperor. It's a very small moment, it's a very niche moment in the series, but I love it. Because Scions in general are not supposed to fight like that. They're supposed to be elite, hard-hitting, fast-moving. But this shows the Death Korps in its total capacity, and why I really do believe that the Death Korps is the best Imperial Guard regiment. It's because they don't care. The Death Korps really just don't care. They only care about one thing, and that's serving the Emperor. They don't care what people think about them, they don't care about how they look, they don't care about any of that. They serve and they die. And even when you have their elite grenadiers who are meant to be shock troopers, trench raiders, standing and firing lines like their bloody Moidian Dying Guard, they don't care. The Death Korps will do what they need to do, and they will get it done. It doesn't matter if they're fighting Chaos Space Marines, demons, orcs, Tyranids, Tau. The Death Korps are humans. Their humanity hasn't been lost, but it's been severely corrupted. It is the guilt, the shame, believing they failed when they should have succeeded, and that stain lays upon their soul. And if you believe that you've done something wrong, you will do everything you can to atone for it. And to the Death Korps, there is only atonement in death. The Death Korps Krieg are a perfect example of how humanity can be twisted and molded and shaped into something so inhumane, but they are perfect for Warhammer 40k. For I've said it once and I'll say it again. Warhammer 40k is a story of humanity living, but how we live. Some are twisted and changed to survive. Some cling to nobility and die early. Others find a middle ground. And the Death Korps of Krieg are just one such example. They will fight and they will die. But not because they're suicidal, not because they want to die, but because they believe it's the only way to make things right. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why the Death Korps are the best Imperial Guard regiment, because they're fighting to do the right thing, or what they perceive to be the right thing, at least according to their twisted minds. But yeah, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for watching. I do love and appreciate each and every one of you. Let me know down below which one of these moments was your favorite. But I would say a massive thank you guys for watching, but even more massive thank you to my awesome members and Patreons. Shout out to my Lieutenant Tier members, Miss Eddie V3, Miss Majora of the Void, and Miss Tori. Shout out to my Sergeant Tier members, Mr. Damiak, Mr. Warsmith Fireheart, Mr. Andy McGee, Mr. Bowen, Mr. Sean R07, Mr. Matthew Merrill, Mr. Sergeant Cossack 68W173D, and Mr. That Guy. Shout out to my Corporal Gym members, Tremel the Math Kitty, Lord Rosarius, Tech Priest Toaster, Mr. Bowen, Shauna Smithers, Gentle Salamander, The Witch of Warhammer, Major Doshinet, Edward King, and Mr. Overanalyze This. Finally, but certainly not least, shout out to my priority members, Mr. Thomas Lawns, Mr. Ivan_SPW, Mr. Monkey Man, Mr. Michael Ayeda, Mr. Diego Castro, Mr. Fortis Unum, Mr. CMDNA, Mr. Eric Massaro, Mr. Dom Marek, Mr. Ken_Sakura333, Mr. Adrian Van Vuren, Morally Bankrupt, Matthew Peter, Joshly1320, Adrax1, Mr. Ethan Elam, U7L, and Mr. Kiri Khan. Thank you, I love each and every one of you for this. Sign up today, you get a bunch of awesome benefits, behind the scenes stuff, early access to these videos, and member only content, not to mention special roles on the Discord. But remember, this will always be free, so whether you give your boy $1 or not, I will love you just the same. Mwah! But ladies and gentlemen, I want to say a massive thank you guys for watching. But ladies and gentlemen, I've been the General Bradley 101. You've been beautiful, awesome, amazing people. Thank you all so very much for watching. And we should stay loyal there, boys and gals. And I will catch y'all next time. Dismiss Rangers. There's something about sci-fi and gas masks that it just works.